始め！
Well. I have returned, Legionaries. Welcome back to the transmission. Sergeant Barnes and I have just exfiltrated from a very nice, serene place and passed through Rome. And I was sitting there, actually in the Forum of Rome. The old Forum, right? The Forum of Augustus, where, the great market stalls used to be, and the temples, and the Senate House, and basically the beating heart of Rome. And it reminded me of when I was a boy, very young. I had visited Italy, and I had gone to the Forum, and I remember having gone down into the ruins for the first time, and I was overcome with emotion. Like, no shit, I teared up, and I was like, emotional about it. It was just the most amazing thing. And of course, if you're someone who is not deeply in love with the idea of Rome, because of course it's just a bunch of stones and old buildings and ruins, really, ruins and museums. But what does this connote? I mean, why is it that it kind of made me feel something that I'd never felt before, especially us young guns, people who don't know what life was like before 9/11. Ultimately, it's an experience of this concept of belonging to a great project, a great people, a great empire, with a mission, a goal that extended beyond oneself, not simply in your life, but throughout time. And it's something that we venerate even now. It's just simply the cornerstone of all Western civilization and civilization as a whole. And surrounded by such serene and majestic imperial ruins, I reflected a lot, especially now. I was looking at the news. There's a lot of commotion going on and great trial and tribulation. Truly, the election of 2024 was a seminal event in human history, because as things are playing out in time, the actions of a shifting worldview are being consummated. And it might seem subtle for some. Of course, there are many who are, and I will say in due time and explicate this case, but the trade tariffs and the realignment of powers, the expression of dissent, the rancor of many different people, and in effect, the absolute dynamism of conflict that penetrates and pervades every single polity within the Greater West. Conversely, there is no similar internal stasis or conflict, societal conflict, in places outside of the West. So, for instance, Russia, China, etc. And so you consider, what is the herald? What is the purpose? What is the driving factor behind and under all the conflict which is happening in the West now, right? And because for as much as a trade war is not a shooting war, it still has almost the same impact. It is still as severe. The market shocks are incredibly devastating, especially as we're raising tariffs and causing damage, economic damage on the international markets. We are creating consumer doubt, lack of confidence, and therefore globalism is shriveling up quickly, just in the turn of a dime. And the investors of magnates by foreign powers are also losing confidence. And so there's this big market shock, or at least the threat of one. But this is just simply an ancillary or maybe a prelude to the greater conflict and conflagration of our time. And why is it that we're in this conflict itself is, of course, we are pursuing the interests of the American Republic, the American people, of the wider West as a whole. We are experiencing, in a certain sense, a social revolution, a patriotic social revolution, which is seeing the complete death of the zeitgeist of classical liberalism. And I don't just mean liberalism in the colloquial sense, which is a leftist. I mean the very thing that caused the American Revolution, the French Revolution, so 1776, 1789. For many, I believe they reflect on the time, especially if you're of the left, and you believe that effectively this is a reactionary political impulse. But it's not. And it's something that has many different parallels with civilizational civil war that we saw during the Peloponnesian War, right, between Sparta and Athens, within the same civilizational sphere of the Hellenic civilization, right, which composed of all the Greek states, all the Greek tribes, and that ultimately it was that event which consummated the totality of the Greek development. And we're seeing that now as it's playing out. We're starting to understand who we are and the values that we're affirming and the values that we are overcoming. And with any overcoming, any cultural revolution, there will always be people who experience pain, because it is a painful experience. Anything worth having, worth doing, any excellence comes at the cost of adversity and sacrifice. For instance, the American Revolution, I think it was something like 70% of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence lost all their fortune. Many of them were personally killed and had their families also slaughtered. And they did this out of a greater calling, a greater mission. And they weren't motivated by petty material interests, right? And what's concerning to me is that much of the pushback that we see regarding securing the American economy, which is, of course, part and parcel of the American Republic, and the future of the economic well-being of American citizens, not simply in our lifetime, but for many lifetimes, our progeny, so our kids, our grandkids, and our great-grandkids, right? Because this is a civilizational tack. This is a huge shift in emphasis towards a different era. But you see from the older generation this concern of, especially from people who supported the patriotic initiative, from people who are going to retire, and it reveals something very concerning. These self-same people who at once are constantly talking about their firearms and talking tough about being patriots are losing faith in the leadership because they took a minor financial hit, which turned out to be a complete false red herring. And it's very interesting to me because what does this imply? It ultimately implies that they're not truly patriots, because what happens is that they're doing this out of their economic self-interest. They're fundamentally selfish, individualistic. And this was not always the case. And it leads to what I'm trying to discuss here now, because when you reference or you look at civilizations from not simply the past, but our contemporaries, for instance, in our adversaries, and you examine how they interact with sacrifice and suffering for the greater good, for their nation, for ultimately their kids, and so on, and that they're willing to suffer and endure and fight for a future, even if it claims everything from them: blood, sweat, and treasure. And this is conspicuously lacking, mostly from, of course, the boomers, and some small part the Gen X, but they're a lot better. This phenomenon, which is endemic to the West, of atomic individualism, consummate selfishness, complete and utter indifference to a greater purpose, to a greater being, and the absolute peasant mindset which only looks down at the earth and looks to one's baser drives of comfort and satiety of the stomach, and ultimately everything which is sensuous but leads downwards without any kind of synthesis into a higher principle, without any higher aspiration in life. And the reason why that is, of course, has to do with the fact that we had adopted liberalism for a long time, and now the chickens have come to roost, and 200 years of this very caustic philosophy have finally woken people to the very quality of this philosophy, which of course is about dissolution. It's caustic, it's inhuman, it's simply something which turns a human being, who is naturally, of course, a social human being. We know this biologically speaking. We are social animals. We are not Hobbesian individuals. We are not strange little Rousseauan perfect beings in the state of nature that are ultimately innocent and good. We are more dynamic and organic than that. I think we have also matured past those petty delusions. Yet, the damage has already been done, and the impulse to overcome this sick existence finally has the impulse to actually conquer and change things. Yet, even though we understand we must reject this thing, rejection is not enough, right? Because rejection leads nowhere. Ultimately, you can't reject a thing. You must overcome a thing. You must either synthesize the good, you must incorporate it into oneself, so that way you can move into the future. But because of the fact that we have atrophied so much as a civilization of ourselves from each other, we have almost forgotten what it means to actually create community, what it means to actually live a life of purpose. How is it that association exists? To what purpose does association exist? What is the greater purpose of even countries, for instance, or the state, and the relation between the individual and the state, and of course, between individuals as such, and whether or not the stratification of any single polity is legitimate or not. There are so many things that we have become simply intellectually, spiritually, and vitalistically impoverished that we have to reclaim, and of course imbibe and simply revivify that part of ourselves that we've long forgotten, or rather we've only forgotten for a relatively short amount of time. Luckily, we have a way of rescuing this key elements of human association, of human flourishing, and the true purpose of what we're here to do. And ultimately, the way that you start to address the problems of our times is by looking to the past in which examples exist of the highest achievement of civilization. Because, as you know, and Spengler talks about this, that, for instance, not every civilization is equal to each other. Every civilization is a meta-organism, right? This is his thesis, and the idea that the West is dead because it has gone past its civilizational cycle, and that ultimately we're in the winter of our time, which some can lament. I do not, because the way I like to see it is it's a way to grow. Just like the phoenix or a forest that is on fire, it's a way to breathe fresh air and fresh life into something that has become old and decrepit, sclerotic, and life-denying. But with this in mind, it's incredibly important that we look to examples for inspiration, perhaps for guidance, or for principles and understanding of oneself. And this is not to say, of course, and I hope you legionaries can give me the benefit of the doubt, what I'm saying here is I don't believe in copy-pasting certain elements of the past. LARPing, for instance, has a certain utility only insofar as that you can element you can synthesize elements of things you're trying to incorporate, but you can't wholesale simply arbitrarily create something from whole cloth, okay? So here is my idea. What the American citizen and the Western citizen in general is lacking is this concept of paideia. Paideia, as defined by the ancient Greeks, by the way, is a system of education designed to cultivate the ideal total citizen. And this is not, of course, your simple schooling that you got, K through 12 in university. Those things are so incredibly impoverished, and they're incredibly compromised in ways that you probably can't even understand yourselves. But what is it that we have to retrieve in this education? Because the education that the Paideia entails is a holistic one. Because it doesn't see the individual as an individual. It doesn't see them as something that is completely cut off from a greater unity. The Greeks, when they associated, so for instance, let's say I am Timon of Athens. No matter where I went, I was always an Athenian. And I would always exude and have responsibilities and be held accountable for the actions of not simply my state, but my actions personally would reflect also on the glory and the communal honor, the honor of my city-state, which the parallel, of course, to our time is our country, right? Our nation. And why is this important? Well, it's not simply a matter of feel-good association. It's the understanding that the individual was part of this meta-organism, this totality, this unit that is composed of course, individuated citizens with their own personalities, their own vocation, their own position in the hierarchy of that society and state, but with the understanding that they belonged to something. They belonged to a multi-generational purpose, a great project. They were part of something, and this didn't simply give people the tether of spiritual feel-goods that people often associate religion with in our time. Like the purpose of religion for most people, especially those that discredit it, is just simply a mental salve or a spiritual salve to be able to exist and experience pain and endure. It is beyond that. What is lacking fundamentally in our time is an axiom, a common purpose, a mission. And this mission can only be found in something that is supra-individual, that is ultimately something which is a devotion to an ideal enfleshed. And that is what a nation is defined. Remember, Nietzsche, as I keep on defining it to you, defined nations by simply being a group of individuals who, over generations, shared a common purpose. So Persians, for instance, are defined by their highest aim being to shoot straight and speak the truth. And over time, as your nation matures, what it does is it starts to biologically reflect the ideals of which that society ultimately posits, right? And we spoke about Strauss and about the idea of the city and the man, and that ultimately the concept is thus, and that the world is divided into natural law and nomos, which is cultural, which is entirely what would be considered amongst, unfortunately, our scientific era, with quote-unquote quotations there, our scientific era as being simply arbitrary and the bigoted force of the community tyrannizing the individual of free thought and free mind. And no, this is not what the utility of nomoi is. What nomoi is basically the commander's intent, right? So when you make a mission, you write commander's intent, and that ultimately the ultimate purpose of this great project, which is what a nation is to achieve this. And thus, of course, there need to be cultural laws which are derived from this central axiom, which reflect and ultimately shape the individual into this greater biological becoming. thoughts like these do not occur to us in the West. Either, of course, you are a communist, and a communist have this trouble where they are equally ciphers, materialistic, and they don't have a greater vision of the future, and reduce everyone to a nameless, faceless cipher of equivalence. And they are the worker, the proletariat, and they're simply cogs of a machine. And then conversely, very similarly, we have the capitalist side, which would regard this with disdain and claim it to be a quasi-communist association because individuals are being maligned and their individual rights are being trampled because for the greater good. This concept of greater good is not part and parcel of the vision of what a capitalist is, because ultimately what is capitalism? It is right-wing, classical, libertarian, Lockean type conception of the universe in which it is about a war of all against all, that we come from a position in which we're individuals, we come into association by mutual benefit, but the natural state of man is that he is an atomic individual, which is patently false. I mean, this is just completely erroneous in every anthropological and biological sense possible. I mean, just to discredit them completely, and I hope the libertarians among you are offended, ultimately, the reason why the individual, like for instance, you put someone in solitary confinement, so deprive them of social interaction, they go crazy. Physically, they mentally go crazy. The only types of people that are capable of actually withstanding the trauma of social isolation and social ostracization are psychopaths and sociopaths. And the individuals who are, for instance, isolated on the frontier, for instance, back in the olden days, in the 1800s, where there were men who lived for months and months on end by themselves, with seeing not another human soul for many a day, for many a month, maybe many a year, would ultimately become mentally compromised as well. So it's not a matter of environment. If you were going to rebuke my statement about the idea that, you know, someone who's put in solitary confinement is going crazy because of their environment, not because of the social isolation, that's obviously could be an element, but remember, this bears out regardless of environment. And so the phenomenon, this idea, going back to defining what Lockean classical liberalism is just built on false premises, and ultimately gives credence and it aids and abets a certain, not simply antisocial, but anti-civilizational, anti-life attitude, which seeks personal gain, personal myopic tactical gain, against one's fellows, one's progeny, and one's friends. And everything comes down to a transactional experience, and therefore, similarly to the Marxian, or rather the Robespierrean Jacobin descendants, both these apparently antipodal philosophies are in fact very common in that how they treat the individual is that they are equally ciphers, they are cogs, and that they are unitary beings atomically and tabula rasa. So tabula rasa meaning, of course, that you're not born with any actual temperament or natural endowments or kind of abilities which differ between person to person. People who are liberals tend to believe that everything's about nurture and very few things are about nature. And communists believe the same thing as well, and it's why they believe that you can reform everyone that you come into contact with, and it makes part and parcel of their philosophy. But time and history and science have completely and categorically rejected this concept of the human being. So, returning to the city-state. What is the city-state? The city-state is this tribe, but tribe not in the low sense, not Lord of the Flies sense, alright, Legionnaires, relax. I'm not going to steal your conch and roast a pig here. What I'm trying to tell you is that ultimately it is, what is a tribe if not the enfleshed ideals and the progress of many generations past, and the generations to come. It gives a ray of activity, of overcoming, of fighting, of living that extends beyond simply this life and your individual person. It is what gives you tether and meaning, and it bears out psychologically, spiritually, biologically, the salubrious effects of these, but also the added benefit of everything else that, for instance, the asabiya, which is an Arabic term called togetherness, solidarity. And this is a concept that is so alien to us because we don't understand the core motivation behind solidarity. Why is it that I would stick up for my fellow no matter what, sacrifice myself selflessly, if at the end of the day we're just motivated for our base personal material gain? Or, conversely, if you're a communist, you should do so only because you're forced to do so, and that it is the good. And if you ask why it's the good, don't ask that. You just have to you just do it, or we send you to Gulag, if that makes sense. It's an absurd civilizational position to be in, right? But, again, returning to the idea of nomos, the idea in which customary law sculpts a natural people into the ideal that they were created for. Some classical examples of peoples who were intentionally created through an ideal, through a law, is of course Lycurgus of Sparta, who set down the parameters of what Sparta was and defined what it was. Rome too had the same experience, in which Romulus and Remus both co-founded at first, and through a mythological kind of motif, Remus is of course spiritually sacrificed in this kind of fraternal war, and Romulus creates this nation from his directive, his will. And that is ultimately what cultural laws and religions and everything else exist for. They exist in the furtherance of the initial will. The will is what is the essence of a nation. It is also the essence of the individual. It gives the center, since the center of gravity, for every individual to be able to understand the axis of action for themselves and to define their position in society, which gives meaning to their lives beyond simply what our zeitgeist has led us to believe till this day, what the boomers believe, right? It's just about pleasure. And people are depressed, and I keep on citing this, but I think it's really important to drum it home. The idea that it's not simply civilizationally are we facing a crisis. The fertility rate is really low, and it's declining rapidly. The economy is, of course, in flux. Conflict between people is increasing. The rates of depression are skyrocketing, even holding for those countries which, for instance, in the United States, there's this argument that depression rates are skyrocketing because of the idea where pharma makes money, and so we're overprescribing, and there's some truth to that. But the trend holds true to even countries where it's actually incredibly restrictive to achieve medication for depression. And so what this means ultimately, if you examine the forest and not the trees, you start to see that this is a crisis on a spiritual level. This loss of an axis. We poured acid on ourselves here in the West, 350 years ago, and now we are finally, because civilization is a massive thing, it takes time for this thing to actually take effect, for it to actually make its philosophy and spiritual impulse felt. And now we have reached the end of the line and gotten to the point where the damage is so critical, it is unavoidable. It is unignorable. And that ultimately what is necessary is a vision of the future which posits great, new, intoxicating missions for a people to constitute themselves and thereby regain meaning and purpose. Remember that Nietzsche told us that ultimately, if you can have a why, you can embrace anyhow. You can endure any adversity. It is when you don't have a why that you succumb to the pressures of everyday life, where things, for instance, that are seemingly natural, like childbirth, are seen as insane torture and ignoble and must be completely avoided at all costs, because why have kids? And with, just to go further with this, why have kids if ultimately they don't represent a continuance of a greater meaning, a greater purpose? They're simply giving birth to a thing which comes at their cost, does not come at a monetary benefit, of course, and they don't know why we do it. If anything, it comes down to nowadays strictly natural habit, which is more and more with contraceptives and technology becoming a problem. Fertility rates are crashing, family union rates are crashing, because why should I sacrifice to be part of a family? Why should I sacrifice to have children? There's no answer to that, because ultimately it's true. If we're individuals, I gain nothing from this. There's no greater purpose for this, aside from, let's say you're one of the few people that actually just want to do it for its own sake, to have children for your own sake, which is very, very small proportion of a population. There is no reason for it. And so why would you? Why wouldn't you just be, like a bachelor for the rest of your life? Because remember, family is difficult. For as much as they're, it's a noble lie, and I love family personally, but remember that this is a great endeavor. It's a painful experience. It's at a financial cost. It is a great risk. It has problems and is fraught with danger and pain and suffering and all kinds of adversity. And when you have no purpose behind this, there is no reason to continue. Right? There's no reason to throw yourself at that. And some people wrongly believe that the way to fix it is by bludgeoning them or cudgeling them over the head that they should. And it's not. That's not how you fix it. You don't force people to do things, because remember, you can't force a girl to like you. You can't just beat her until she likes you. That's ridiculous. And ultimately, you have to understand humans exist on that same plane. They psychologically exist on that same plane. Man needs to dream. Man needs purpose. Man needs purpose. Man needs purpose, I say, far more than he needs to eat. He needs purpose more than he needs nice things, gold and silver and distraction. He needs purpose. And we saw this with, for instance, there are studies done in the Holocaust. Viktor Frankl, great psychologist, and he talked about the survival rates amongst those who had a greater calling, i.e. religion, right? Because remember, Judaism, so he was examining Judaism. Judaism is not simply a religion, it's an ethnicity, it's one and the same. That's what normal religions are. And that ultimately those who were actually religious or had some great purpose, they survived. They were able to endure. And conversely, those who lived or were known for being bohemian types, or kind of the individual that just wanted to enjoy life and be a kind of Stephen Zweig type, so a frivolous wallpaper bohemian person that hedonistically lives for the moment, those were the first to go. And this should be informative to you, because it should highlight principally how important this central kind of nebulous idea, this soft cultural thing, how important it is for the human soul, and it has real effects in reality of the individual and of any nation, of course, because any nation is a gestalt of the composite parts, which are the individuals, of course. And so what I'm trying to explain is that there is this thing that is almost biologically informed. And if I may be so bold, it is spiritually informed. And legionary, you should be spiritual. Those are the three standing orders of this legion, right? You're going to be mentally tough, physically fit, spiritually robust. Because ultimately, in due course, I'll show you how deep humanity and your existence goes, and how much was robbed from you before you were even born, and how much you can gain simply by coming to understand and know, not simply the efficacy, but understand spiritually, mythically, the reality of life. And so, without further ado, I want to present the Paideia. Well, first of all, let's have a sip of Jim Beam that Sergeant Barnes just kindly poured for me. 1 second. Now let us transport ourselves 2,700 years into the past and place us on those marble cliffs of white gypsum and arid landscapes. Surrounding us is an azure Aegean Sea. And we find ourselves in the midst of Athens. Socrates and Plato are babbling on. People are going about their business in the agora. There are debates. There are philosophers. There are artists. There are merchants. There are men and women, or rather just men, because women, remember, unless they were slaves, I suppose, were shunted, especially aristocratic women, were kept within doors, especially in the Athenian polity. Tearing ourselves away from the beauty of the Aegean Sea, we walk down to the gymnasium. Here lies the heart of the youth and of the future of Athens. Walking through the greatly adorned bronze doors of the gymnasia, we enter and we see this marble adorned interior, sand pits where men are wrestling, speaking philosophy, being instructed, and disciplining, exercising their perfect bodies into becoming the ultimate warrior, the ultimate champions of Athens themselves, jockeying for power at the center of this agon, right? The competition, competing with each other in good faith to elicit excellence between men and the ultimate achievement of excellence for all. And the name of this achievement goes by the name Kalos Kagathos. And each of these fine young gentlemen who are training, straining, overcoming, fighting, and triumphing over their adversaries are ultimately striving for this thing, this concept, which seeks the unity of physical beauty, physical dynamism and robustness, with moral and intellectual acumen and excellence as well. For the Greeks, it was not simply enough to be good at the one thing. They sought to be total human beings. Rather, they even sought to surpass humanity. They wanted to train themselves, to sculpt themselves spiritually, mentally, physically into gods. And that was the purpose. The realm of the ideal made flesh, made manifest in a person's unity, in their person. This is what the Greeks pressed young boys into, and their course of education conditioned them from a young age. In a certain way, we still have a lot of these things which the Greeks first developed, but the utility, or rather the intent, is completely different. We don't have the same aspirations of physical and mental and spiritual perfection all in one person. We don't expect that out of others. In fact, we don't even laud those or exalt those who excel beyond others. In fact, we consider that as something that we've inherited, unfortunately, from Christianity. The idea that to achieve this apotheosis is hubris and should be shunted. In other words, this is the ressentiment of the slave. The ones who are so botched and bungled, they could not achieve what the best could achieve for themselves. And this is what Greece offered the world in a way that hadn't been seen before or since. Before the city-state, and I think I got a little bit ahead of myself here, Greece was marked by certain epochs. Greece is not simply this one point in time in the world in which the Greek city-state existed like something out of Hercules from the Disney movie, and there are already defined cities. It wasn't always that way. During Homeric times, the majority of human association was agricultural. The warrior elite ruled. The nature of their rule was aristocratic, and the form of life in which they engaged was primarily pastoral. And this is important, right? This is the part that I think you should really listen to here, Legionaries, because ultimately it was the experience of the aristocracy in breeding cows, horses, and other farm animals of various different kinds into greater and greater, stronger and smarter beasts to, in effect, leaven them through animal husbandry, made them realize that this same principle applied to animals can also be applied to humans. And here is the psychological development, or rather the meta-psychological cultural paradigm that emerged. The idea that man could be selected for and ultimately made better every generation to become stronger, more beautiful, and more capable. And with this revelation came its accompanying idea, right? The idea of excellence. That it's not a wash. That there are things that we can affect in order to hone excellence. And so this is where the Greeks get the origin of the great Homeric heroes such as Achilles and Odysseus and so on. It is through these conscious pairings defined by the ancestral and cultural laws of the aristocracy of their respective tribes that they created great specimens, expanded outwards into the concept of cultivating individuals in the same way as the aristocracy in general cultivated themselves over generations. And so here we see the fundament of the morality and the worldview of the Greek. So just to break it down Barney style here, what I'm saying is the Greeks of antiquity, of the Homeric era, were able to understand that the same principles of how you could purposefully cross certain specimens of horse to breed a better and bigger and stronger horse every sequential generation, the same principle can be applied to humans, and therefore, with this understanding of continuity between generations, that ultimately this means that Greeks chose to cross the best with the best to leaven the heroes among them, or rather the excellent among them, to higher and higher stature until ultimately they become those lauded figures such as Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, and so on. Homer, again, was the first educator of the Greek peoples. It was Homer who taught the Greeks to dream beyond simply what they had done in the Mycenaean era that preceded the Trojan War. It was the first time that the Greeks came to understand themselves as Greeks as such, right? Because There's a reason why they're referred to as the Danaans, and ultimately each and every single petty king and lord of some kind that Agamemnon called into a coalition to fight that Bronze Age city of the Trojan War, that ultimately it was that very thing that gave birth to a pan-Hellenic consciousness, which bound up the disparate peoples of this, at first, nebulous and proto-group. And the means by which the ideal was connoted was through the life and story of all the heroes, and their experiences and competitions, conflicts, trials, triumphs, and their alliances and conflicts with the gods, and their experiences and emotions which their environment and events elicited, and the commentary between, of course. And so the Iliad, by the way, if you've never read the Iliad, you have to read the Iliad, absolutely. But back in the day, the best way to connote your intent is by effusing, exalting your ideal in a story, and by leveraging the tradition, the story of the past of men who existed as archetypes of ideals, and in their rendition, or rather their heroic example, you have a model to lead your own life in approach of that ideal. And as a sidebar here, like, I think this is the importance of fiction, rather good fiction, right? Because ultimately, and forget all the smut books that like women read, that it's like complete BS, or a lot of the modern literature that comes out of the West since, honestly, like since 1935. Generally speaking, what you need from fiction, you get with more informed example than you would from a, say, philosophical treatise that is completely abstract and idealistic, right? So, what do I mean? So, for instance, the reason why the Iliad is so evocative and important, and is the let's say cornerstone of Greek civilization, and I would say even Western civilization, is that it shows the principle in action. So it shows what, let's say, strength or brotherly love looks like, loyalty, correct, how do you say, the way that you present yourself before a king, how to hold your temper, and also conversely when they make mistakes. And the greatness of Homer and fiction in general is that it's fundamentally human and natural, and so ultimately weaves the ideal by showing it in practice, and ultimately even the mistakes are informative to the reader. This is something that just is so hard to approach when you think of abstracts of principles. So, you know, like the Marine Corps, JJ did tie buckle, which is leadership traits. It's all well and good that these are principles, and it's necessary to elucidate them in no uncertain terms. However, it's important to further explore the meaning of those things in act. That is way more important. And this is why, obviously, Plato understands that music is shaping of a body politic, or the individual education of a person. It conditions them with certain thoughts, which is why personally I don't watch TV, or I don't watch or listen to music which has themes that are things which exalt the wrong ideals, the ideals which would undermine me. And for instance, I don't watch anything that exalts weakness or cowardice or excuses it, or, you know, for instance, rap music. There are some benefits to it, but like at the same time, it's all about being a scumbag. It's all about the base appetites of life, and it doesn't raise your eyes from the ground to the horizon. And this is precisely what Plato was talking about, how the conditioning of man should be a full incorporation of music, for instance, and that music, the content of that music, had to be regulated. This might seem like jarring to the American ear because, unfortunately, we're so brainwashed with this kind of HIV ideology that all information is just as good as the other. But it bears out in psychology and scientific studies that you become those things that you give your mental awareness to. When you look at something, you become that thing, and it requires intense and consistent effort to condition yourself towards a higher ideal, because it is so wanting in our life. There is no true example of heroism, of greatness of soul, of ambition, and so on. It's all this kind of base indoctrination, and ultimately this is the thing that Homer gives to the Greeks, but also Plato leverages Homer, and yet later, of course, he would have his critiques of Homer because he understands that it's not necessarily good enough for creating a city-state, but Homer still has that impulse, that fire, that extends beyond the aesthetic. And remember that true art must always be a unity of the good, right? It's not simply the moral good, but an ideal with an aesthetic representation. And both are equally important. Aesthetics are not themselves a value neutral. What is beautiful is necessarily good, and what is good is necessarily can be beautiful, but it must be represented, it must be birthed into the world correctly to connote those things. And it's in this depth of understanding that ultimately Plato, later of course, Socrates for instance, and all this kind of stuff, gets to understand that it is the beautiful which licits and motivates the soul into becoming something great. And sidebar again, but this is why there are so many problems with the United States. Like, forget what's on TV, forget what's in the music. Look at our buildings. It's endless, soulless suburbs or decrepit, brutalist inner cities, or these just honestly obelisk dystopian skyscrapers. The only skyscraper that was ever beautiful was the Empire State Building. And remember, Art Deco, if you investigate a little bit further, Art Deco was about vitalism. It was a school of art created that sought to overcome, of course, the effeteness and stultifying spirit of the late 1800s, that sought the future and sought strength. And if you see, for instance, in DC, there's this great bridge next to the Lincoln Memorial. Forget the Lincoln Memorial. We're going to level that crap like when we win, okay? That's just what's going to happen, Legionaries, okay? We're going to replace it with a great big triumphal arch, okay? It's going to be great. It's going to be amazing. No, but in all seriousness, though, the freaking bridge has these Art Deco strong statues of woman and man on horseback, representing the American worker and the American soldier, pillars of the Republic. It is over that bridge that when in 1991 we had a victory parade around Arlington, it was over precisely that bridge that was the one we chose to basically effect our triumph. And it is beautiful, because what it is the highest ideal of the American spirit, strength and industry. And this is kind of, people kind of take it for granted that art for art's sake somehow is necessarily a good. It is not. This is a communist, bullshit, nihilist perspective of things. Things have meaning, and the mythology of things have meaning, more so than even the mythology of scientism, right? Because remember, science is not meant to actually connote some kind of spiritual depth. It is simply a tool, just like rationality is, okay? Rationality is a tool, and there are obvious shortcomings. There are things which are deduced correctly from a logical standpoint, so you can have a logical deduction of a certain phenomena, but it is a very blunt tool. It is not like you consider most things to be. And that is the challenge of our day, is to constantly forget ourselves, that we forget the utility of that which is not necessarily definite, that which is nebulous and what is called soft, right? Soft power, in the sense of it's not a hard skill like STEM, for instance. It's something entirely spiritual, and I don't think we necessarily truly understand it in our time as far as what the mechanism of that is. But with the advent of, or the field of quantum physics, we're starting to understand that not all energy, all matter is definite. Which it means to say is, Schrodinger's cat, that like basically mass can be both in a place, not in a place, both or neither at the same time before observation. And it's not necessarily that it's the observing that causes its manifestation. It's that it comes in and out of existence, and it comes in and out of a certain quantum position. So, like, what that means is, like, the wall that you see in front of you, for instance, or the building that you see in front of you, if you're listening to this in your car, in principle, that car is flashing in and out of existence and going to somewhere that is beyond. Now, where is that beyond? Most men call that God, a spiritual place. To say nothing, of course, where does energy come from? And I don't suppose, I'm not trying to posit, an answer to this, but what this should indicate to us all is that the precepts of the 20th century, especially the Enlightenment, are not sufficient to articulate the true world, because, frankly, the empiricist, or rather, and remember, empiricism is the philosophy that everything must be deduced from the sensory experience. So we can only engage with that which we can observe, okay? Like, you can't make castles in the clouds, so to speak, and from their perspective, because those are things that are not verifiable in the material world. But this base materialism is the very point, is the very problem of our time, because there is something that exists beyond. There's a spirit, there's a soul. Everyone has it. We live and dance in the eye of God. Life is a spiritual event, and when I say that, legionaries, like, I think I get a lot of people joke around and think it's like some kind of verbosity or some kind of bombasm, but like, no, I mean it. Life is a spiritual event, and you're being graded at every moment in time. Your intentions, your actions, everything you do matters. Gladiator was a great movie precisely because of this one quote, and I'll hand it to Ridley Scott, who's a total, whatever. I don't want to say it because otherwise I'll get interdicted by the communists. But what I'll say is, what you do in life echoes in an eternity, and it's true. It bears out not simply in your personal life and how it affects you, but everything you do, even the smallest action that you think is of no consequence, does have a consequence. And with this understanding comes immense responsibility. You matter. Your family matters. Greater ideals matter. And this is precisely what the Greek spirit understood. There is no such thing as vanity, in the sense of nothing is in vain. All matters. And this is the spirit of the Homeric soul, that it transmute what is the tragic view of life, because life is tragic. We all die. We all grow old. We all become mangled and corrupted by this world in a way that we weren't in our youth. Others of us do things purposefully, to our bodies, to our souls, to our friends, to whatever, which mangles the world. And I'm saying, I'm not perfect either. I do things that I mess up in my life. Everyone has. But it's the choice that we lead every day, that we choose what we do in every moment, that matters. And this is what the story of Homer is effectively making aesthetic, glorifying, saying yes to life, yes to the tragedy of life, yes to, in spite of all odds, in spite of certain death, in spite of corruption of your body, of your soul over time, one can live forever in just one moment of excellence. And this is the germinating spirit of Homer and later, of course, would be honed into a greater meaning with this advent of Plato and Socratism, etc. And so, progressing to the next stage of Greek civilization, remember I told you there was archaic Greece, which is Mycenaean Greece, then there's like Homeric Greece, and then of course we finally develop into the city-state culture, which is what we consider to be the hallmark of Greek civilization, right? The height of Greek civilization. And this comes at its greatest conflagration, at its greatest moment of self-immolation and greatness, and elicits the greatness in each city-state and each action. So, for instance, during the Peloponnesian War, and for just to give you a background what the Peloponnesian War is, it's of course a war that is pitted between coalitions. One coalition is headed by Athens, and the other is headed by, in the Peloponnesian League, the Spartans. And the substance of these coalitions also matters too. So it's an ideological war. So the ideological war of Athens is to promote democracy, right? Because it is a democratic power. And for Sparta, it is to continue. It's a conservative state that wants to continue the tradition of mixed government and what they call oligarchy, right? This is how Thucydides referred to them. Remember, Thucydides was an Athenian who fought in the war himself, who was a statesman and a general, so he was there first. But I think it's important to understand that the content of this conflict actually had a lot of impact in the sense that what democracy, the ideological war in its proxies, were splitting the city-states of other countries. So remember, every city was its own country, right? What we call country, each polity, each state. And that each state that was not, Sparta or Athens were severely divided by its impulses. Every city had those who favored the oligarchy, and they tended to be, of course, of the aristocracy of that city. And then, of course, there were democratic factions, which tended to be represented the hoi polloi, or rather the common people. And this is important because it starts to make one understand why it is that aristocracy began to ebb. And you see this in, for instance, Pindar and Theognis. Both of these poets, lyric poets, remember, poetry is just as impactful as outright philosophy in shaping the people. But both these guys were trying to effuse or exalt or glorify the aristocratic spirit. And this aristocratic spirit is that of the higher. Conversely, there are those who the democratic spirit, which was best found in Hesiod, which favored what is low in man, rather what is most mediocre about wisdom, about passivity, about humility, cowardice, and I mean they didn't say cowardice, but I call it cowardice because it is pathetic. And you see this in our time, right? The people who tear down the high, that call, pride sin, that call X, Y, or Z sin, and they tear things down. But I think people really just don't get that, legionaries. I gotta take a sip of this whiskey. Hold on one second. What people don't understand, damn, that's fucking tough. Holy shit. No, what people don't understand is the following, is that what is ideal in man, what is greater in man, naturally lends itself to what the highest men are. And what do I mean? I mean to say that what is aristocracy? Aristocracy literally means the best, in the sense of the ultimate, the kind of the men who are the best. So it's not simply about being rich, because especially Theognis and Pindar, they don't exalt material wealth. What they're exalting is a way of being. Because remember, the soul is the only true wealth a man has. Honor is the only true wealth a man has. Everything else is transitory. Wealth comes and goes like the seasons. The calamities and triumphs of life come outside of your control. You can't affect, total victory. You can influence your environment, but you can't help it if you get hit by a tsunami or an act of God. And so much of life is arbitrary in that way. And the Greeks understood this. They called it fate. They called it destiny, providence, that no man can escape their fate. But what you can do is in the time between now and then, and even when you're facing trial and tribulation, that you can win. Because victory is within. It is not without. And so ultimately, this is the content of the aristocrat. Because the funny thing is, when you stop caring about the outward victory of life, whether it's wealth, whether it's power, whether it's success on the battleground of the arena. So if you're a wrestler or you're a fighter or you're doing a foot race or so on, the irony is that the men who are the best, they're not the ones competing against others. What they're actually doing is conquering themselves. And with that attitude, that is the only attitude that you actually can elicit power and actually strengthen your body to such a pitch that you vanquish both nature and rival man in act. So it's kind of like a paradox, because to be victorious without, you have to not care about the victory outside. You care about the victory within. And it is this motif that Socrates actually picks up on. And the greatest irony is this. So it's pretty funny, right? Like, we talk about the idea of Athens, and if you listen to liberals, they always say Athens is this kind of, utopia which was like democrat. It's like basically modern America, and nothing could be further from the truth. And they claim, of course, Socrates and Plato and the greatest thinkers by default, right? They say Athens was American democracy, and therefore everything that was a product of Athens was necessarily a reflection of its democratic spirit. And I could tell you this without a doubt, nothing is further from the truth. Because the general people don't know that Athens, actually, the reason why it became a cultural flourishing was because of the tyranny of Pisistratus. This is the guy that actually completely destroyed democracy within Athens, and he became basically what is called the tyrant, but the correct term is basically a proto-Caesarian figure. And it is in his court that he, in a stratified society, that you're able to sponsor high art, right? Because, as you can see in our time, the lack of sponsorship for the low arts, or rather for high arts, stems from the fact that we don't have an aristocracy. The reason why all of our art is vulgar, meaningless, BS, rap, bad architecture, poor taste in clothes, the vulgarity of day-to-day life, the taste of whatever, is because they believe that, or rather not what they believe, but what happens is, in a level society, the impulse, the principle of artistic spirit caters to the low, the average man. And I'm telling you, if you're listening to this transmission right now, Legionary, you are not the average man. You're something greater, and if you're not one right now, you will become one. And the very fact that you are listening to this an hour in makes you one of those. So never, never, ever confuse yourself with the low classes. You're a warrior. You're something above. You're an aristocrat of the soul. And if you're not, this is not for you. And I've come to throw you under our yoke. Either way, going back. So, it is only when there is a high tyrant, they call it tyrant back in Greek days, but it's a Caesarian figure, a monarch, that you're able to sponsor high art. This is where the height of Western Europe came from, the kingdoms, right? The sponsorship, for instance. Unfortunately, the Bourbons made the mistake of sponsoring the very people who would undo them, the democratic spirit of their time, Rousseau, Voltaire, etc. But it is they who also sponsored high art that transmuted the medieval poor-sounding music to something that became absolutely beautiful, and Beethoven, and etc. And so Mozart, etc. And so what I'm trying to say to you is the same thing played out in Athens, where Pisistratus started to sponsor and give patronage to men of all the arts. So the art of culture, of plastic art, so sculpture, of, let's say, architecture, of poetry, of philosophy. And it is precisely because of his patronage that the germinating culture of Athens took place. This is the milieu that Socrates came from, and Plato, and later Aristotle. Remember, the academy was sponsored, or rather indirectly, by Pisistratus. And during the war, the interesting thing is that Socrates, Plato, and all them, they actually liked Sparta. They idealized Sparta. They believed that Sparta was superior to Athens, superior to the democratic spirit. And do you know why? Because remember, it was democracy that killed Socrates, that made him drink the hemlock. It was democracy that killed their champion, Alcibiades, during the war, who was extremely capable, so capable, in fact, that he was able to destroy Athens because Athens betrayed him. And to be frank with you, he was right to do so. He was right to do so because the people, they don't deserve their aristocracy. Because remember, the content of a nation comes from its elites, and it's the elites that are the nation. It's not the rabble. It's not the masses. These ciphers, these disgusting slaves. No. It's actually the aristocracy. It is they who have the intellectual command and interest and self-discipline to overcome. Notice, for instance, in our life, you know how most people that win the lottery, especially if they come from humble means, they usually destroy themselves within, I think it's like statistically 3 years. They destroy their lives. It's like some people are saying to themselves, I wish I won the lottery. Beware, my friend. You might just get what you want. And that's the thing, is that, like, it's not wealth that ennobles. It is the character of man. Because I think most of us don't understand that all that wealth does is magnify who you are at this present moment. And the reason why most people are not wealthy, most people, not some, is because they don't have the character or natural capacity to actually be a good steward of resources. It's something that people don't understand is the very cornerstone. You have to understand that it is the mechanism within. It's the soul that masters life. It's not outside factors. It's not outside factors. Everything is agency. And this is why communism is so profoundly evil, is because ultimately they make the claim that man is only a reflection of his environment. But every great man and elite man, legionary, knows that his environment is a product of himself. It is a reflection of his inner soul. The way that you organize your room, for instance, whether it's organized or not, whether it's clean or not, how it's decorated, how beautifully it's decorated, the higher ideals actually manifest themselves in real life. Look at your home. How do you keep your bed? How do you keep your house? Do you take out the trash and clean? Do you wash the floors? Do you make sure everything's organized and basically put in a way that's optimal and utilitarian and at the same time aesthetic, that it serves as a catalyst to higher thoughts and higher principles? Be honest with yourselves, reflect. And this is what I'm talking about, is that some small example like that can be extrapolated out into wider society. And so this is where the project of Plato comes, is that what he wants to do in the city-state is bring the aristocratic ideal of the high that was very much the preserve of a very chosen few, and rightfully so, by the way, and proselytize it to everyone, to absolutely everyone in society for their benefit, for their leavening. And this has been good. This is a good evolution in my personal perspective, because ultimately I believe in discipline. I believe that if man can be educated, of course we all have our natural limitations. No matter how much I study quantum physics, I'll still be a retard, okay? So at the end of the day, we have to be humble enough to understand our position in society. We have to understand that there is a stratification. But that doesn't mean that you are any more or less than anyone. However, we have to be okay with being of a lesser rank, because at the end of the day, we are all one team. We are all one team, and every man is important. Some are more important than the others, but the thing is, we all have to work together. And so if you're someone, who comes from humble means, who, is trying to get ahead at life, who's trying to build themselves and, kind of master themselves, there is nothing wrong with being humble. The same thing comes from myself. I can see men who are better than myself and honor them. That is the difference between us and the communists, is that they see people who are more beautiful, more intelligent, more successful, and they want to tear them down. I don't. What I want to do is exalt that ideal, exalt their excellence, admire the excellence, help those fellow men and women from, to my side, left and right and down, and bring them up as well towards that ideal. And of course, I always believe in myself. Within, my inner monologue always believes that I can achieve anything. Even though in act it doesn't necessarily manifest itself, that's okay. It's not necessarily about actually winning in the material sense. It's not about being the best actually. It's about being the best of who I am. It's the victory within. That is the spiritual essence of your life. That is the mission of your life. Life is meant to be hard. Life is a warfare on purpose. Embrace it. Say yes to life. Because ultimately, this is the calling of what we're trying to do here. The victory was always within. And I mean, this is an idiosyncrasy of mine, but I do believe in reincarnation in a sense. It's just like Patton, right? And every time that you succeed in life, that you are overall a good man, and you succeed in overcoming the challenges that are unique to yourself, and you know those challenges, and they are specific to you. Some of you may have problems with drinking or even drugs. Or some of you are maybe of a higher caliber, let's say, and let's say your challenge is something more subtle. Maybe it's that you want to be a good family man. Or maybe it's that you actually want to pursue meaningful leadership positions, like whether it's in the military or in civil service. And it's about exalting who you are and overcoming and expanding the bounds of who you thought you could possibly be, and overcoming that threshold. No matter what it is, that is the purpose of life. It may seem like it has no purpose, but it does. And I can't tell you what the city in the hazy horizon, what it looks like, the kingdom of heaven, so to speak. But I can tell you that every action you make, every thought you consider matters. You are the cumulus of your actions. You are the cumulus of your thoughts. Your friends and family are a reflection of you, and you have to take extreme ownership of your life. Because it is when each and every man feels this way, this is when we start birthing the modern Greek spirit in America in modern times, with, of course, the American spirit, with our own kind of ethos to synthesize the higher ideal within ourselves. And it starts with you. It starts with very small things. It starts with waking up in the morning. It starts with working out every day. It starts with going to the gym. It starts with going to freaking work. And not simply working, but even no matter how menial your job is. I've occupied some pretty menial jobs. I've poured cement before. Things which are absolutely exhausting. I remember working 12-hour days, and for some of you boys who have ever worked like blue-collar jobs, like cement is freaking hard. It tears your body down. It quiets your mind. It exhausts you so profoundly that when you get it back at the end of the day, you don't want to do anything at all. But that's the moment when it's hard, when you feel like you live a dismal existence. That's the moment when you choose excellence. That's the moment that you know that you have to be the best that you can be. And so, for instance, I chose to act excellently even when I was doing something that was, frankly, I felt at a certain sense demeaning to me. Although there's nothing demeaning about it, to be frank with you, but the idea is that you have to continue regardless. Be humble and be excellent. Pour that concrete correctly. Do a good job in mixing it. Be on time. Don't commit time fraud. Whatever it may be. Be honest. Have integrity. And so, when you pursue excellence, even in the small things, I would come back home tired, and then I would still make sure that my home was clean, organized. I would still, obviously because you're expending so many calories and your body's so tired, I had to scale down to a 3-day-a-week lifting routine, but I still went, even when I didn't feel like it, even when I felt like I was exhausted. I remember, I'd work Monday through Saturday, and I would sleep on Saturday, and I would sleep just like a rock. When you're able to do that, and you're able to keep the faith, no matter what happens on the outside, that is where things start to happen to you. And that is exactly the attitude that, first of all, when I was doing that, because of that ethos, after a year and a half, 2 years, basically my foremans and so on recognized who I was, the quality of my work, the quality of who I was as a man, and then they offered me a position higher and then higher, and that's when you get promoted, because at the end of the day, people always select for the best, and it's not simply like a kind of moral thing. Men want winners. Every American loves a winner. And so this is the very essence of what being aristocratic and having ideals is. It's excellence even in the small, especially when it's tough. Every day is a separate life. And even if you fall off the warpath, and I have, my friends, I've gone to moments where I gotten super freaking fat. I've gotten to moments where I was super blue and I didn't want to do anything at all, like certain periods of my life. But it's about the strength of getting back on the warpath, back into affirming those higher ideals and never giving up. And that means never quitting. And you can never basically lose if you never quit. And never quitting means that you always get up, even if you get flung off the warpath for whatever freaking reason. So, let's bring it back to the ancient Greeks. We talk about the city-state, and this is something that I was talking about, equality. And it's a motif that I wrote about specifically, on a thread and on X or whatever. But I'm going to speak to you here what I mean by equality, or rather, what the Greeks understood equality to mean. There are two types of equality. And because Greek is such a deep language, they have multiple names for the same phenomenon from different facets. It is a very advanced language, and for those of you who don't know a second language, you know a second language deeply, which is fine, and you don't have to. The point that I'm trying to make is Greek is so rich precisely because it goes all the way down to explicate very niche, specific meanings. Equality was defined in two terms: isonomia and isokratia. Isokratia means basically the equality of rights, the equality of power, and the equality of, let's say, outcome, right? Economic outcome. This is communism, right? This is what democracy is. This is what democracy, like Athens, was at its lowest ebb, right? It was when they killed Socrates and Alcibiades, okay? That is what democracy and esocratia is. When the founders made the American Republic, they were referencing isonomia, which is poorly translated to equality before the law. Equality before the law is not a good, let's say, understanding of what it means, because we start to have false connotations of it being the same as isokratia. It's not. what that means, equality before the law, it simply means that all are equally part of the law, which is really different because each citizen can be unequal, and legitimately so. So what do I mean by this? Take, for instance, the Spartan state. There were the Spartiate, and then there were Perioikoi. Even though the Perioikoi, which are the freemen who were citizens of Sparta, yet they didn't have the same rights as the elites, the Spartiate, right? Yet they were equals, so to speak, Isonomia. They were part of a polity. That means that you're simply part of a city. Because remember, law is the essence of a city. And why is law the essence of a city? Law is the codified will of the overall people, right? And I don't mean the individuals within that city. They're not legitimate in defining, any one person is not legitimate in defining what the city is. It is that, think of it as like a meta ideal, like Sparta, right? So Sparta is, everyone is part of Sparta and is equally on the same team. Everyone wears the same uniform, so to speak, but everyone occupies a different position. The best illusion I can think of is, for instance, when you're in the military, you're part of a battalion or a platoon. Everyone is equally part of that platoon, equally within the jurisdiction of the commanders of that platoon, but as you know, there are different ranks, and there's a stratified hierarchy within that military unit. The same concept is applied on the bigger level of a state, or rather, the city-state or a country. Not all men are created equal, and that is the biggest false, fake thing to ever have been uttered ever, and it's part of the calamity that has befallen us, the self-own of enlightenment. Because the fact is, we weren't. Not all of us are going to be super geniuses. Not all of us are going to just simply be the best. I remember when I was a kid, there was this so I was being raised in a certain place, and I went to a school. There was this guy who came from France, and, he was everything I wanted to be. He was tall, strong, charming, but he was also humble. He was incredibly erudite. He was, not simply did he effortlessly score well at school, but he also did extracurricular activities, in addition to, of course, his natural, instinctual, artistic, let's say, personal projects of his. And in every facet of life, he was better than me. And I remember this. I had a consuming jealousy. I was just so fucking, pink Wojak mad, you know what I mean? But I remember thinking to myself one night, and I was a little kid, right? I was like 11 or 12. And I was like, no, that is what's precisely ugly in me. But the greater point that I'm trying to make here is that there are men that are like that, men and women that are like that, just in every way better, and there are people who are in every way lesser. But that doesn't also mean that, we somehow disparage the lesser and exalt the higher. What we do is we honor what is highest, right? We honor the greater men. We have the, let's say, healthy narcissism, healthy egoism, to believe that maybe one day we can achieve it and give our all to try, though that is not the purpose. The outcome is not the purpose. It's the action. And basically, it's the willing and the trying that is the good. But also, we're helping our fellow men through leadership, through extreme ownership, to help those who need a little bit more help, who need a little bit more, education, who needs a little bit more understanding, who needs a little bit more this or that or the other thing, because they are lost too. And that is precisely what's wrong with our time. In our time, either you're a communist or you're like a plutocrat or this very selfish person. And what happens is we have a lack of community in the sense that we don't care for the lower, we don't care for those who are more humble, who need more help. And at the same time, we tear down the higher. We want to take their wealth. We want to take their status. We want to take their glories from them. We deny them these things. And both of these impulses are wrong. They're wrong. And moreover, by the way, when communists do kind of stuff in our time, which is ostensibly to help the like the not so great guys of our society, they're not helping them. They're basically reinforcing what is terrible in them. So, for instance, some people think that, for instance, drug addiction, right? Some people think that the answer to drug addiction is decriminalizing and making legal hard drugs. Okay, and I'm not going to be like a fairy princess here. I'm not saying I've never done it before. I have, okay? Like, I've made mistakes before in my life. But what I'm trying to explain to you, Legionary, is that I know in the heart of hearts of things, we all know that doing opium will fuck up your life permanently, okay? If you let it. And the way that the communists want to basically help these people is by pouring fuel on the fire. Because remember that for them, they believe that achieving an ideal, the highest ideal, is impossible. And it is. But for them, it is a self-refutation. Because it's unachievable to them, they believe that it's not worthy of pursuit. And that's precisely what makes them so low, so untouchable, so disgusting. Because that is the essence of man, is to try and achieve and perish in the pursuit of the impossible. That is what makes one aristocratic. That's what makes you a legionary, right? And so what is necessary is to give tough love, to give these people discipline, to give these people a vision, something worth living for, something that is part of a family. And that is what a city should have been. That is what Athens and Sparta were. They were a family with a mission, enfleshed in blood and sweat, in tears, in tragedy, in triumph, together. And when you fall on the battlefield or in old age at home after a life of great service to your community, to your family, to yourself, what's highest in yourself, that is when you know that you've achieved the highest good, the kalos kagathos, as the Greeks used to call it. I think it's important that we keep this concise. I wanted this to be more of an introduction to the concept of Paideia and the idea in which in subsequent transmissions we'll be examining it in further detail. But the reason why it's so necessary, the reason why I think we should talk about this is because the attitude, the very essence or the attitude of leavening the citizen body, the commonality, the solidarity between citizens, the common understanding and the common mission of the city being one's own, and while at the same time not obliterating the individual. So you're still yourself, but in an individuated part of a greater whole, one which extends through time and space. This is the attitude we need to re-imbibe into the American Republic. This is the new path forward. Coming at the very quarter millennia anniversary of the American Revolution comes the great restoration of the American nation. And it starts with you. It starts with commanding yourself to believing in yourself in a higher ideal. It comes with helping selflessly your fellow man, your fellow citizen, to raise each other up and to expect the best of yourself into the world. This common service, this idea, a number of different ideas which we have just completely atrophied in the West, need to be reinvigorated, revitalized. And it starts with you, right? It starts with this small little transmission. Look, just mask off for a second. Just all this aside, in all seriousness, it starts with leadership. It starts with the agency, okay? And it starts with talking about how it is that we see an idealized form of the Republic. The idea that we live not for comfort, not for treasure, not for the personal glory of maybe power, let's say. It begins when we start to understand that it's about the common good, the common ideal trying to be achieved. America could be a nation greater than Greece, greater than Rome, greater than anything that has ever been seen before, but we can't achieve the empire which will exist amongst the stars if we don't conquer the city within, if we don't leaven the citizen body. And so I've come to you like Lycurgus came to Sparta with a mandate that A, you demand the best of yourself and you dedicate the rest of your life to this higher excellence, to honor, courage, excellence, right? And then B, it starts with helping your family, being a leader to all your family members, to being selfless, to having justice, to having good judgment, to being decisive, having integrity, discipline, bearing, unselfishness, knowledge, loyalty, and being enthusiastic, spreading joy and encouragement everywhere you go, invigorating those whose morale is sagging, and exalting those who have achieved great things, and in those whose achievements may be more humble, but giving them the props and the certitude that they achieved something. Laud them. Help them. That's what's required. Give them honors. Don't be afraid of looking like a fool or seeming as though you're imposing yourself. You should be imposing yourself. Make yourself felt. Be indifferent to the opinions of the masses. Let them look down their nose up at us. America starts when you start having the courage and the conviction to be above the opinions of those who can't even command themselves. I have a vision of the United States. I have a vision of my fellow men that extends beyond even simply what has been in the past. And this is a mistake of conservatives to simply want to be the same or to look to the past to try and make the same thing happen again, copy paste. I'm not trying to do that. What we're trying to do here is to gather the manna, the essence of a thing, and port it into the present in order to conquer the future. Because any solution that we come up with will always be organic and a natural synthesis with what America is, what America truly is, its essence, and the best elements we can import from others and learn from others to become better. And there's no shame in taking technologies or cultural ideas from others and synthesizing it naturally into the tapestry of our nation and our national consciousness. This happened in Rome, for instance, and it happened in the material elements of Rome. So first, the gladius, you always know, first was a Spaniard, a gallows Spaniard sword of technology. The Gerousia, or rather the Senate, was actually a Carthaginian, Punic invention. Originally, Rome had been a kingdom, remember? And the Gerousia, or rather the Council of Nobles, the way that it finally turned into the Senate, is an importation of technology, a custom from abroad. And then finally, of course, we talk about the ideals from the Greeks, but remember that Plato took a lot of philosophical and spiritual inspiration from the ancient Egyptians. So there's nothing wrong with taking good ideas and making it your own. What is wrong is when you wholesale, artificially impose it. The answers to our questions will be uniquely American, but the impulse may be gleaned from elsewhere. I think that America, ideally, and just to give you a kind of solid background as to what I think America could be and what the ideal should be, right? So not necessarily an ideal in the utopian sense, because we live in the real world. There will never be a utopia. You don't want a utopia. You don't want a world that is devoid of conflict and strife and self-overcoming, because that is death. I don't want peace. Peace is death. I want war. I want the war of self-conquest, the war of ourselves with life. I want us to be strong. And what does strong look like on a republic level? What does it look like on a civilizational level? It looks like your average man, for instance, is healthy. Look around you. Why are there so many obese people? Think about it. It's not just, poor eating habits. Mostly, actually, it has to do with the fact that we let plutocrats fit our food filled with crap, with plastic, with harmful pesticides. And guess what? When we raise concerns regarding the health and efficacy of our food supply, so many oligarchs and people who are corruptible, the politicians are corruptible, citizens are corruptible, they take bribes to shut it down. They buy journalists of no, well, journalists definitely don't have any honor, but the idea is that they use them to launder a brainwashing campaign in multiple different ways to prevent our republic from making sure that the common good are being fed quality food. And there are follow-on effects of having an unhealthy citizen body. Forget the rates of depression skyrocketing. Look at, for instance, not simply your body, but the lack of production, industry, the lack of actual people having children. Even being obese does not make you attractive to anyone, man or woman. It doesn't make you healthy. It kills you. These people are killing Americans. They're killing our potential. They're killing our life. And this stems from the very fact that our republic thinks that we shouldn't care for the common good because they always couch their perfidy, their evil, in terms of freedom. That who are we to command others to be healthy, right? That's I'm interdicting your personal right to fast food slop. Well, in a healthy society, that would be correct. That's right. You will be healthy. Secondarily, we would have conscript service. Ancient Athens had conscript service. You had to serve for 2 years. You were, as part of your education, you went through the gymnasia, which is the equivalent of our schooling. You spent, when you were 18, when you hit 18, you did 2 years of military service in the barracks and serving your country. It's not just for the martial efficacy of having a trained reserve corps of citizens ready to fight. No. The purpose of conscript service is entirely to leaven the citizen body. The values which are enforced and conditioned into the individual, discipline and honor and courage and friendship and loyalty and love for each other and willing enthusiasm. Pessimism is defeatism and it's evil. Enthusiasm and the idea that it doesn't matter if you have to charge a machine gun nest, that victory is always at hand because even if you pass away, you will be remembered forever in the halls of the Republic and the great triumphs of our people, of our future. So, being healthy is a big thing. Conscript service as a tool, an educational tool, is important. That's what will be ideal. Tertiarily, what we'll see is the subordination of the economy to the interests of the Republic, or rather, to the interests of the common good. Why is it that we abandon 75% of this country so that way we can import scab labor for the very few who enrich themselves at the expense of those very people who protect them and create an environment in which they can enjoy their ill-gotten gains? No more. We're going to start holding people accountable. We'll start imbibing the value in each and every citizen of having a service mindset to their life. You don't have to wear a uniform to be a patriot. Patriotic duty extends to every facet of society. Forget patriotism. Just being a good man means helping those of your countrymen and your family and taking ownership of your environment. If you're a business owner or whatever it may be, hire Americans. That we hire our countrymen to give them a living wage. People wonder why communism is on the rise, and they never consider the fact that it's because of the predatory capitalistic habits that we've basically I don't know. We just as a country just don't care about Americans. And an example from the past, Henry Ford is a great man. Do you know why? Because on his production floor, all his factory workers were given wages that were 250% above the median, above what was the average wage of his time. And his competitors thought he was crazy. They thought he was going to drive himself under because of his largesse. And look at Ford. Look at what great things he created. Not simply cars and the American way of life as we know it, but he actually created a new ideal of what the American worker and the American business owner should be. Both look out for each other, just like one team. And they create great things together. Ford was absolutely quintessential to multiple American war efforts, down to this day. When we care about something greater than ourselves, we become great ourselves. We become great. And that's what I want for you, Legionaries. I want your greatness, because you winning, demanding the best of yourself, trying and failing multiple times, and still getting back up to try your best, that is the very essence of our city, of our republic, of our greatness, of our American exceptional destiny. That is when we start to become what we were before our decrepitude. Further, I believe that the franchise should be restricted to those who have served, who have given civil service, whether in the military or otherwise, to our republic. It's not a perfect way of cleaving those who are interested or self-interested, because certainly there are many who are self-interested. And even today, there are many who cynically go and commission in the military so that way they can leverage it into their political career and ultimately for their own personal aggrandizement. But imagine if one day we were able to make a republic like Starship Troopers, where we believed, where there was like a core of the political elite who believed, true believers in the American Republic. Imagine what we could achieve, what great things, great dreams we could dream during the day when we're alive and awake and we act on those dreams. Imagine what we could achieve. We were the first nation on the moon. We will be the first nation amongst the stars. And we can only do that when we start to make sure that it's not the scumbags, the worst of our society that rule, but the best. The best of us. The best of what's within us. And it starts with overcoming this idea of equality, the democratic idea of equality. The Founding Fathers railed against democracy multiple times. There's a reason we're called a republic, and why I emphasize that title is precisely because the republic represents the interests of all the citizen body, but it understands that governance is not a privilege, it's not a right, it's a duty. It's a higher calling. It is something extremely sensitive. It demands extreme accountability, responsibility, integrity, capacity to actually rule. So not simply, being a good dude, but actually a good dude who is capable of winning. Because I don't want just simply good dudes. I want you, legionaries, who are capable. And even if you think at this moment you're not capable, to become so, to become proficient, to become soldier princes of the future. And I don't care if you're 80 or you're in the cradle of your youth. You can start today. You can achieve great things regardless of where you are in your life, financially, or, socially. Regardless of what you've done in the past, you are not who you were yesterday. You are who you choose to become. And so finally, of course, the last thing here that I kind of would suggest is the following. That ultimately we have to overcome what was. There needs to be a cultural evolution of the American ethos. This caustic individualism needs to stop. This idea that the American dream is about going to America and hitting it big on the slots, you know? America is not your freaking casino. It's not a freaking Walmart. It's not an economic zone. It's not here so you can hit a bunch of raffle tickets at Chuck E. Cheese and get a freaking nice prize. America is something that demands everything from you. And the payment which you receive is purpose and spiritual fullness. This is what is lacking in our time. Purpose. The nihilism of our time is our lack of willingness to give ourselves over to higher things than personal fortune or wealth, to the greed of prestige or false celebrity, of whatever it may be. Comfort. That is actually the 30 pieces of silver that corrupts our society. The irony is that plutocrats wouldn't exist if the average man didn't take their 30 pieces of silver. And to be frank with you, I believe in accountability. We can always point the fickle finger at everyone else, but let's be real here. It's the middle class that allowed this. It's the middle class that was corrupted and allowed themselves to be ruled by evil people because they wanted their little suburban house and their car, and they were ensconced in weakness, and they loved comfort so much that they abandoned their principles. And this is the vision of America: a healthy America, a martial America, a responsible America, a future America. And so I leave you here with this poem. Though it's not of ancient Greece, it's the Lays of Rome, but this is the very ethos that I want you to believe in fully with all your heart, because it is everything to me. It is everything that I think we should become, and the element or the ethos of poetry is more powerful than any treatise of Plato or, whatever it may be, some kind of freaking Nietzsche or whatever. So here we go. I'm reading from Horatius now. For Romans in Romans' quarrel spared neither land nor gold, nor son nor wife, nor limb nor life. Then all were for the state. Then the great man helped the poor, and the poor man loved the great. Then lands and spoils were fairly portioned. The Romans were like brothers in the brave days of old. Macaulay. That's all I got for you, Legionaries. Like I said, I'll be continuing this series in more detail. I'll be talking about, obviously, the ancient Greek tradition of Paideia, and or at least what I would posit, a modern American rendition of this, of the spirit of this, in our time. But without further ado, Sergeant Barnes and I have to go on patrol again. We have to check on the Legionaries on the line, check the wire, so on and so forth. You know, all that officer crap. So, without further ado, this is General Lance, Sergeant Barnes, and this is Politeia, signing off.